Hey everyone. Today I'll be discussing how hallucinations occur in the brain as well as conditions like schizophrenia. To start, I'd like to characterize some of the symptoms that are associated with schizophrenia. Generally speaking, symptoms can be divided into two different categories, positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are those that modify or add to typical behaviors or worldviews in some way. Meanwhile, negative symptoms are referring to the absence of behaviors or thoughts that would typically be present. So, to give some examples, some positive symptoms in schizophrenia are delusions, which is to say that you have thoughts or a worldview that isn't supported by evidence that others would see. For example, you might have a delusion of a conspiracy going on, that there are people plotting against you, and so that contributes to other positive symptoms like paranoia. Another positive symptom is hallucinations. And so hallucinations are often confused with delusions, but hallucinations specifically refer to any sort of a stimulus that you perceive to be there that isn't there. And so these can be visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, olfactory hallucinations, and so on. Another positive symptom is disorganized speech, and so your speech patterns may be a little bit more convoluted or rushed than typical. Additionally, there's catatonia, and catatonia refers to an almost stupor-like state because there's muted motor activity as well as a decreased emotional reactivity, seemingly. And so with catatonia, there's some confusion about why this might be classified as a positive symptom as opposed to a negative symptom when it refers to an almost stupor-like state. But the reason that catatonia is considered a positive symptom is that it's an addition or an excess of a behavior that would be considered typical. And so it's the extended or prolonged state of seemingly limited emotional and physical reactivity. Moving on to negative symptoms. One negative symptom that's quite common in schizophrenia is reduced motivation-driven behavior, and so this is a symptom that overlaps heavily also with symptoms of depression. Additionally, alogia and anhedonia are quite common, with alogia being a reduction in the number of words typically spoken, and anhedonia being a reduction in the ability to feel pleasure, and so oftentimes schizophrenia will coincide with depression because of that. Additionally, with schizophrenia, there's a reduced drive for social activity and social interaction. With that background, I'll go ahead and discuss some of the hypotheses that have emerged regarding the onset of schizophrenia. And so it could be that a combination of these factors are influencing the emergence of schizophrenic symptoms. The first hypothesis that I'll explain is the excitation-inhibition imbalance model. So, in the brain, there are two different types of neurons generally: excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons, where excitatory neurons will promote certain activities and inhibitory neurons will reduce certain activities. In the brain, a very common type of excitatory neuron is the pyramidal neuron, and these neurons will release a particular neurotransmitter called glutamate, among others, and they're especially important in controlling cognition, perception, behavior, emotion, memory, as well as other executive functions. And so, typically, what occurs in neural circuits is that these excitatory pyramidal neurons will release glutamate to other neurons with NMDA receptors. And NMDA receptors are important in this neural circuit because they're responsible for functions such as learning, memory, as well as other matters related to cognition. However, these excitatory neurons will then excite what are inhibitory neurons that have NMDA receptors on them. And so, because inhibitory neurons are getting stimulated even more via glutamate, there's going to be increased inhibition. And so, these inhibitory neurons, being stimulated more, will then release more of an inhibitory neurotransmitter called GABA. And the important thing to note is that because there's more inhibition, these GABAergic neurons can then reach back and inhibit the activity of other excitatory pyramidal neurons. And so Because of this cycle where you have excitation of inhibitory neurons that can then reach back and inhibit those excitatory neurons, there's a built-in control mechanism for pyramidal neuron excitation. And this is what's seen in the typical neural circuit. However, the hypothesis is that in schizophrenia, there's a reduction of these NMDA receptors in terms of their efficacy and the ability of these NMDA receptors to trigger an inhibitory GABAergic response. And so what happens is instead of this controlled feedback mechanism where you have a balance of excitatory and inhibitory signals, and thus neural activity is kept within a certain specific range, what happens is you have overexcitation. You've taken away that control mechanism, and now pyramidal neurons can basically go rampant in terms of the excitatory signals that they're sending out. And that can contribute to a lot of positive symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations because there's overexcitation in regions of the brain related to perception of the world and the integration of emotions into memories and your recollection of how certain events occurred. Thus, you have overexcitation of perception and cognition circuits. Now I'll start with explaining the neurodevelopmental model. This one is a little bit more simple than the excitation inhibition imbalance model. Essentially, on each individual neuron, you have dendrites, which are these spiny extensions that are responsible for transmitting chemical signals between different neurons. And so here we have a picture of two neurons that are in close contact, and in the neurodevelopmental model, the suggestion is that there's reduced connectivity or communication between neurons because the size of the dendrites is reduced. And so with that, there's a hypothesis that there's reduced integration and unification in neural circuits across the brain because with smaller dendrites, there's a reduced ability for chemical signaling between neurons. Next, I'll go ahead and cover the dopamine hypothesis. So, the dopamine hypothesis, I will say, is a little bit more complicated than what I'm presenting here, but I decided to take a few snippets of the dopamine hypothesis just for the sake of simplicity and as a general introduction to this model of schizophrenia. So, in the dopamine hypothesis, there's an emphasis on the effect of an excitatory neurotransmitter called dopamine on the symptoms of schizophrenia. And so the dopamine hypothesis suggests that there may be overactivity in a pathway called the mesolimbic pathway. The mesolimbic pathway is particularly important because it's involved in the synthesis of dopamine and the projection of dopaminergic signaling for functions like memory, emotion, as well as your behavior. So excitatory signaling or overexcitatory signaling in the mesolimbic pathway can contribute to some of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia related to paranoia because that essentially ties together emotion with your perception of the world and your altered memory of events. And additionally, hyperactivity in dopaminergic neurons of the mesolimbic pathway can contribute to some of the emotional affect deviations that occur with schizophrenia. Additionally, the dopamine hypothesis suggests that there could be reduced dopaminergic activity in a related pathway called the mesocortical pathway. The reason that that's particularly interesting is that the mesocortical pathway is also a very important pathway in the brain for stimulating dopaminergic activity, but it is responsible for relaying dopaminergic signaling to a region of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC for short, is responsible for a large part of executive functioning, including decision making, planning, and something called working memory. Now, working memory is very important because it's essentially trapping your perception of short term events in your brain. And that is especially important for helping you evaluate your reality and your world in real time. And so, if there's reduced dopaminergic activity in the mesocortical pathway and reduced dopaminergic signaling in the prefrontal cortex, that could drastically impact first behavior, but also your real-time perception of events as they're happening around you. Now I'll discuss some of the functional differences that occur in schizophrenia. So, the brain generally has three different modes that it's in. That is a bit of an oversimplification, but these are different modes that have been discovered through an imaging technique called fMRI, which essentially uses blood oxygenation to measure levels of activity in the brain. So, generally speaking, these three different networks that we have in our brain are the salient network, the central executive network, and the default mode network. I'll start by describing the default mode network. Essentially, this is a pattern of activity in the brain that's commonly seen when we're at rest. Essentially, this is responsible for a lot of self-referential reflection, daydreaming, imagination. It's basically the mode that your brain goes into when you don't have any particularly pressing cognitive tasks at hand and you're not particularly stressed. Meanwhile, the central executive network, or the CEN for short, is a pattern of activity in the brain or a network of structures in the brain that's associated with engaging you during intense problem solving and increasing your focus, attention, and general cognitive activity. And between these two networks, the salience network is responsible for acting like an executive control switch. Basically, it will balance the default mode network and the central executive network so that you can switch between the two as needed. So, as you're walking into class, maybe you're in the default mode network because, well, you're thinking about your day and what you want for lunch and that friend you're going to talk to later. But then as you sit down for class and your teacher starts lecturing, you're going to be switching into the central executive network so that you can really pay attention to the new lesson at hand. And the salience network will be responsible for making that executive decision of when to switch your brain into these different modes. And so the reason that's important in schizophrenia is that there's a suggestion that there could be altered activity in the salience network and the central executive network so that there is a different pattern of switching between the default mode network and the central executive network. And so I don't want to go too into depth on this because the science on this is still emerging, and so I don't want to speak out of turn in terms of what's already known about this possible mechanism of action behind schizophrenia. But you can imagine why a finding like this would be very important in understanding schizophrenia because if you are struggling to switch between the central executive network and the default mode network, that might alter the way that you, first of all, engage in social scenarios, but it could also impact the default mode of your brain when it comes to analyzing events that are happening before you. Now I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of the structural differences in the brain and some of the particular brain regions that are implicated in schizophrenia. So, for the sake of brevity, I'll only dive into two regions here. But the first region that's particularly important in schizophrenia is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC for short. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is seen to generally be less active on average in people with schizophrenia than in control subjects. And the reason that that's important is that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is largely responsible for working memory. That's a concept that I had introduced a little bit ago, but to recap, working memory is largely responsible for holding events in place in your memory in the short term so that you can process them in real time. And so if there's altered activity in the DLPFC, that would largely affect the way that you perceive your world and people around you and events that are currently happening. And the other region where altered activity is typically exhibited in schizophrenia is the striatum. The striatum is a hub in a network in the brain called the basal ganglia, and the striatum is actually a term that encompasses a few other regions within it. One of the regions in the striatum is the nucleus accumbens, which is responsible for reward perception and linking reward to motivated behavior. And so altered activity in the striatum is largely going to be responsible for the positive and negative symptoms exhibited in schizophrenia, because since the striatum links things like reward to motivated behavior and habit formation, a lot of the way that you interact socially and your motivation to pick up certain habits and behaviors will be determined by the striatum. Next, I'll go ahead and move into talking about white matter connectivity. And so, what white matter connectivity refers to are the actual connective bundles or tracks that allow for different neurons and neural circuits across different regions of the brain to communicate with one another. And so, white matter connectivity is often measured with a neuroimaging technique called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI for short. And what DTI measures is an index called fractional anisotropy. And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but essentially, fractional anisotropy refers to the restriction of the movement of water molecules in the brain. And so it's on a scale of 0 to 1, with 1 being very high restriction of the movement of water molecules in the brain, and 0 being almost no restriction in the direction of water molecules within the brain. And the reason that that index is important is that the more restriction of the direction of movement or flow of water molecules in the brain, the more structural integrity a white matter tract will have, and so the more intact that white matter tract is. And so in schizophrenia, there have been DTI studies confirming that on average there's reduced fractional anisotropy in a few different white matter tracks, and I'll go ahead and cover some of them here. There are others, and if you're interested, I'd recommend going into the literature because there's plenty of fascinating DTI studies on schizophrenia. So, the few white matter tracts that I'll mention here that have been implicated in schizophrenia are the superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is highlighted in blue here, and the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, which is highlighted in orange, as well as the unsnit fasciculus, which is highlighted in green. And so the superior longitudinal fasciculus is a very large white matter tract that actually traverses all four lobes: parietal, temporal, frontal, and occipital. And so because it traverses so many different lobes, it has a critical function in visual spatial focus, as well as your general perception and cognition of the world. So specifically with regards to visual spatial focus, that's going to be very important in schizophrenia related to positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, because the superior longitudinal fasciculus is going to be important for communication between different brain regions so that your brain can form a coherent perception of the visual, auditory, and other stimuli that are coming in and being integrated and processed. Moving on, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus is a shorter white matter tract than the superior longitudinal fasciculus, but nonetheless extremely important because it's responsible for visual memory, object recognition, and emotion. And so it's going to tie emotion to different sensory perceptions that are coming in, as well as it's responsible for actually transferring the different perceptions and sensory stimuli that are coming in and integrating them into long-term memories. And so your perception of reality is largely based on your memory of events. And so in schizophrenia, if you have alterations in your perception and memory of events that you witness, that's going to largely determine your understanding of reality. Lastly, I'll go ahead and talk about the unsnit fasciculus, and the unsnit fasciculus is a very important white matter tract that's largely present in the limbic system and the temporal lobe. And so the unsnit fasciculus is also going to be critical for integrating emotion with memory and behavior. And so this is the reason that a lot of your emotional state and your current mood will inform the way that you act and the way that you reflect on your memories. Okay, lastly, I'll go ahead and dive into some of the medication-based treatment options that are available right now for schizophrenia. There are other treatment options that are not medication-based, but I would like to go ahead and dive specifically into the pharmacological treatment options for schizophrenia. The first class of drug that's heavily important for schizophrenia are serotonin receptor antagonists. And so, before I explain the mechanism of action of this particular class of drug, I'll go ahead and provide some background on serotonergic signaling in the brain. So, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's extremely important for mood regulation as well as modulating the activity of other neurotransmitters, as we'll see right now. So, let's say that you have this neuron here that is sending out from its axon terminal serotonin molecules. And in some pathways in the brain, these serotonin molecules will then go on to bind to other dopaminergic neurons that have a specific class of receptor called 5-HT2A receptors. And so 5-HT2A receptors on dopaminergic neurons will be sensitive and receptive to binding of serotonin. And so the effect that serotonin will have on these dopaminergic neurons as a result of binding to these receptors is actually inhibitory. So, to summarize, serotonin binding to dopaminergic neurons with these 5-HT2A receptors will inhibit the release of dopamine in the associated neural circuit. The reason that this particular type of activity is important in schizophrenia is that, let's say you have hyperactivity or too much activity of these serotonergic neurons, and there's too much serotonin being released. Well, that would result in hypoactivity or excessive inhibition of these dopaminergic neurons, which could contribute to symptoms that arise due to insufficient dopaminergic activity in the mesocortical pathway. You may recall that the mesocortical pathway was particularly important in the pathogenesis of schizophrenia because of the relationship between reward and planning, as well as working memory and your perception of events that are happening around you. And so, what medications that act as serotonin receptor antagonists achieve are blocking the 5-HT2A receptors so that serotonin, even if it's released, cannot reduce dopaminergic neuron activity. And so medications like olanzapine are commonly prescribed in cases of schizophrenia in order to help manage negative symptoms. The second class of drug that I'll discuss for schizophrenia are dopamine receptor antagonists. It is important to note as a caveat that a lot of medications that are already out and also being developed for schizophrenia actually have a dual function where they are both serotonin receptor antagonists, but then they may also have some dopamine receptor antagonist properties. And so, in certain dopaminergic neurons with a specific class of receptor called D2 receptors, medications like risperidone have potential to block these D2 receptors to inhibit dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway. And so I want to make an important distinction here because it might be a little bit confusing. In the case of serotonin receptor antagonists, we're trying to block the inhibition of dopaminergic neurons in order to increase dopamine activity. But with dopamine receptor antagonists, we're trying to directly block dopaminergic neurons to reduce dopaminergic activity. And so you might be asking, well, wait, why are medications being prescribed for schizophrenia both increasing dopamine activity and decreasing dopamine activity? And the key distinction is where they act in the brain. Because in schizophrenia, there are certain circuits where the issue is hypoactivity of dopaminergic neurons, and there are other circuits where the issue is hyperactivity of dopaminergic neurons. So that's an important distinction to make. In the case of serotonin receptor antagonists, typically the mode of action of medications like olanzapine is going to be in the mesocortical pathway, where there is insufficient dopaminergic activity. Meanwhile, medications like risperidone are going to primarily act in the mesolimbic pathway, where there is too much dopaminergic activity. And so in this way, there's potential to improve the management of positive and negative symptoms with differential activity in dopaminergic signaling across the mesolimbic and mesocortical pathways. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture. I really hope that you guys had the chance to learn something about schizophrenia, and I'm really excited to see you guys in the next lecture.